Humanity cut all ties with the Galactic Council, and the galaxy fell into chaos. The seal hit the table before the translator had even finished speaking. I heard it from 2 rows back, a sharp, clean sound, like a door being shut firmly but without anger. Ambassador Kira Voss had placed the Galactic Council seal face down on the obsidian surface, and the room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. 47 alien species, hundreds of delegates, the largest diplomatic gathering in 300 years, and not one of them made a sound. My name is Ren Okafor. I was 29 years old, carrying a datacore satchel and a diplomatic aid badge that still had a crease down the middle because I had ironed it that morning. I had been in the council chamber exactly 6 times before. I had never seen anything like what happened next. Kira stood straight. She was a small woman, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that made you feel like the room was moving around her rather than the other way around. She looked slowly around the chamber, not at the delegates, but at the chamber itself. The carved stone walls. The hanging banners of the member species. The great central light that had burned for 3 centuries without going out. She looked at it the way someone looks at a house they grew up in, when they know they are never coming back. The Terran delegation thanks the Council for 312 years of cooperation, she said. Her voice carried perfectly. It always did. We wish every member species health, prosperity, and the wisdom to use what they have learned. The Velhari delegate, a tall creature with silver crest fins that rose and fell with its mood, made a sharp sound. I had studied enough Velhari to know that sound meant confusion edging toward alarm. The Dreth Hegemony's block of 12 delegates turned to one another. The Muir, who rarely spoke, went very still. Ambassador Voss. The council presiding voice, an ancient Velhari elder named Councillor HFY, leaned forward from the high bench. The session has not concluded. The matter of Sector 9 infrastructure requires human engineering oversight too. It will not have it, Kira said simply. Not rudely. Not with anger. Simply, clearly, as if she were stating a weather forecast. HFY's crest fins rose to full height. I beg your. All Terran engineering, medical, and logistics personnel currently operating within Council space are completing handover documentation as I speak. Jump gate relay stations, atmospheric processors, medical synthesis networks, all have been given their full maintenance logs and operating manuals. Those documents are in every written language registered with the Council. Any species with the will to read them will find everything they need. She picked up her data reader, slid it into her coat, and looked one more time at the presiding bench. Humanity is leaving the Galactic Council. Effective today. All treaties, trade obligations, defense accords, and border agreements between the Terran Compact and the Council are hereby dissolved. Our exclusion zone will extend 40 light-years from Terran space. Any vessel crossing without prior authorization will be turned away. The Velhari delegate made a sound I had never heard before and hope never to hear again. It was something between a cry and a hiss, the sound of genuine, cold fear. You cannot, HFY said, and his voice had cracked slightly. The infrastructure alone, the medical networks, species will struggle, Kira said. Yes. I know. We have known for 60 years that this day would come, and for 60 years we tried every other option first. She turned and walked toward the exit. I fell into step behind her because that was my job, because my legs moved before my brain gave the order, because watching Kira Voss walk through a room had always felt like watching gravity in action. But I turned back once. Just once. The chamber was erupting now, voices, signals, translation feeds crossing each other in a storm of noise. The Dreth delegates were standing. The Muir had begun a low, resonant sound that meant distress in their culture. The great light overhead still burned steadily. 47 species, looking at a table with a seal lying face down on it, beginning to understand something they had never truly considered before. The humans were gone. And they had no idea what that meant yet. I caught up to Kira in the corridor. She did not slow down. Ambassador, I said. They're going to panic. Yes, she said. The Velhari atmospheric stations, the processors we built, they only have 2, maybe 3 years before they need full maintenance cycles. Without our engineers. I know, Ren. People could. I know. She stopped walking. She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had not expected. Not coldness. Not regret either. Something that looked like the face of a person who had carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and had finally, after exhausting every alternative, set it down. I spent 40 years in that room, she said. I watched us save the Velhari from the Muir border incursion, and when we asked for equal trade tariffs in return, they laughed and said we were being impatient. I watched us rebuild the Dreth medical grid after the Cascade Plague, and they thanked us by vetoing our seat on the Outer Systems Committee for the 13th consecutive year. I watched human engineers work 18-hour shifts on a station that had no human residential quarter. They slept in cargo bays, because the council said accommodating humans was not in the budget. She looked back toward the chamber doors. We have been their best workers, their best doctors, their best diplomats, and their least valued members. We tried negotiating. We tried petitioning. We tried waiting. We have been waiting for 300 years. She started walking again. Now they can try waiting. I followed her down the corridor, through the side bay, and up into the transport dock where the last human shuttle was idling. The crew chief, a young man named Patrick Cole, gave us a nod and sealed the door behind us. I found a window seat. Seleth Station shrank behind us, that enormous, ancient, beautiful structure that humanity had helped build, had helped maintain, had helped run for 3 centuries. I watched it until it was a bright point of light, and then a dim one, and then nothing. The stars looked the same as they always had. But something had changed. Something large and irrevocable and terrifying in the best possible way. Patrick appeared beside me with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, from Earth stock. He handed me one without a word, looked out the window for a moment, then said quietly, "My grandfather worked the council docks for 30 years. Never got a residency permit. Had to renew his temporary pass every 6 months." "I know," I said. "He would have liked today." I did not say anything. I looked at my coffee. I thought about the Velhari delegates' crest fins, flat with fear. I thought about all the people on that station who were already, right now, pulling out maintenance manuals that nobody had ever read and staring at words in a language that felt very foreign without a human engineer standing next to them to explain it. I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not guilt. I had expected guilt. What I felt was something quieter than that. A kind of sorrow that had nothing to do with regret. The sorrow of watching something break that should have been fixed a long time ago. And underneath it, so deep it barely made a sound, something that felt like pride. We crossed the exclusion line 4 hours later. Patrick announced it over the cabin speaker, and several people clapped. I did not clap. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed my eyes. We were going home. The galaxy was going to have to figure out the rest on its own. That was the hardest part to carry, not what we had done, but what we already knew was coming. The fraying. The struggling. The very long, very painful education that was about to begin out there, in the dark, among species who had never once had to ask themselves the question that every human child learns before they can read. What do you do when the person who fixes everything is no longer coming? You learn. Or you do not. But you learn alone. 18 months later, I was on New Carthage, and I was doing something I had never had time to do while working for the council. I was sleeping 8 hours a night. The Office of Human Reclamation had set up in a converted cargo depot on the northern edge of Port Callaway, not a glamorous address, but then, the work was not glamorous either. We were cataloging what came back when we came home. The engineers who had spent decades maintaining alien infrastructure. The doctors who had run council medical stations. The diplomats who had sat in chambers where their voices counted for half a vote. They came home, and most of them needed time to remember what it felt like to be somewhere where they were not the help. I ran the incoming documentation desk. 18 months of form processing, interview records, debrief notes, technology audits. 18 months of quiet, steady, purposeful work that did not involve a single alien ambassador demanding an emergency meeting at 2 in the morning. I had started to feel almost normal again. Then the distress buoy crossed the exclusion line. I was finishing lunch, a sandwich, real bread, something else I had not had time for in my council years, when the alert tone sounded on my secondary screen. Not an alarm. Just a tone. The kind that said something had arrived in the monitoring buffer and was waiting to be logged. I pulled it up. The buoy's origin code was Velhari. The signal was a standard distress format, but it had been stripped down, no diplomatic headers, no council routing stamps. Someone had sent this raw, directly, as if they wanted it to reach us without going through official channels. I opened the translation. It was short. Atmospheric Processor Array, Grid Sectors 4 through 11, Velhari Homeworld. Failure in the primary catalysis sequence. Backup regulators degrading. Estimated safe operation window, 14 months. Request immediate engineering consultation. I sat with that for a moment. 14 months. 2 billion people on the Velhari homeworld. The atmospheric processor array that humanity had designed, built, and maintained for 60 years, a system so woven into their world's survival that removing it would be like removing lungs. They had the manuals. Kira had said so. Everything had been handed over. Every log, every schematic, every calibration record. I pulled up the handover files. The manuals were there. 7,000 pages of engineering documentation, precisely translated into Velhari script. Complete. Thorough. Everything a trained engineer would need. The problem, I realized as I sat there reading, was the word trained. The Velhari had never trained atmospheric engineers because they had never needed to. For 60 years, if the processors needed attention, a human team came and attended to them. The manuals were complete. But a manual tells you what to do. It does not teach you how to think through a problem you have never seen before. I looked at the distress message again. 14 months. 14 months before the catalysis sequence crossed a threshold that no manual entry would be able to walk an untrained technician through safely. I wrote up the log entry. I flagged it as received. I noted the translation. I followed every procedure, stamped every field, and submitted it to my supervisor, a steady woman named Claire Alderton, who had been running frontier logistics for 20 years and approached every problem with the same expression, thoughtful, unsentimental, exact. She read the summary I had attached. She looked at it for a long time. "You know what this means," I said. "It means the Velhari atmospheric system is degrading on the schedule our engineers predicted it would," she said. "It means 2 billion people." "I know what it means, Ran. Claire. This goes to the Parliamentary Review Board. Everything does. I do not have the authority to respond to a council space distress signal, and neither do you. That is the process. The process exists for a reason." She looked at me steadily. "File it. Log it. Send it up." I filed it. I logged it. I sent it up. I went home that evening to my small apartment in Port Callaway and I sat by the window for a long time, watching the city lights come on one by one as the sun went down. New Carthage had its own sky, wide and deep blue, with a moon that rose early and set late. Earth-like but not Earth. A world that humans had built from nearly nothing, without asking anyone's permission, without needing anyone to come and fix things for them. I thought about the Velhari delegate in the council chamber 18 months ago. The crest fins flat with fear. The sound they had made. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I went to the council archives, the public record, available to any registered former council employee, which I still was, and I started reading. Not current documents. Old ones. I went back 40 years, then 60, then 100. I pulled up session records. Committee votes. Internal memos from council administrative bodies that had been classified at the time and had only recently entered the public archive under the 30-year disclosure rule. I read for 5 hours. I found a memo from 82 years ago, written by the Dreth Hegemony's chief administrator to the council internal policy office. It was discussing the question of whether humans should be given full voting rights on the Outer Systems Committee. The memo was 6 pages long. On page 4, there was a paragraph that I read 3 times. It said, "The Terran species demonstrates considerable utility in technical and medical functions." Full voting representation, however, risks a shift in council priorities toward Terran concerns, which are frequently at odds with established member interests. It is recommended that Terran participation remain at its current advisory level, which provides the benefit of their capabilities without the complications of their formal influence. Utility. Not partnership. Not membership. Not respect. Utility. I found another document from 50 years ago, a Council Health Committee report discussing a plague outbreak on a human colony world in the Outer Territories. The colony had requested emergency supply shipments. The committee had debated it for 11 weeks. 11 weeks. The same committee had approved an emergency response to a Velhari border station within 4 days the previous year. The colony's death toll, by the time supplies arrived, was listed in the report as a footnote. A single line. Followed immediately by the next agenda item. I kept reading. I found evidence of human engineering proposals that had been quietly shelved because implementing them would have reduced other species' dependency on human expertise, and some council members had preferred maintaining that dependency to solving the underlying problem, because the dependency gave them leverage over Terran diplomatic requests. They had kept us needed. Not valued. Needed. There is a difference. A tool is needed. A partner is valued. I closed the archives at midnight. I sat in the dark for a while. Then I made a cup of coffee, the good kind, the one I kept for bad days, and I thought about Claire's face as she had said, the process exists for a reason. She was right. She was completely right. And I had followed the process. But somewhere out there, 14 months away from a crisis, 2 billion people were looking at 7,000 pages of documentation and realizing that nobody had ever taught them how to think. The Parliamentary Review Board would take the distress signal seriously. I believed that. I had to believe that. They would deliberate, weigh it, and reach a considered decision. I just lay awake for a long time, listening to Port Callaway settle into night, wondering what considered felt like to someone watching a number tick down. 14 months. 13 months and 29 days now. I went to sleep. I dreamed about manuals. The shuttle landed without clearance, which is not supposed to be possible at Port Callaway. The Port Authority has 17 layers of approach confirmation, 3 separate identification sweeps, and a hard barrier system that is physically incapable of allowing an unregistered vessel to touch down on a commercial pad. Our engineers built it. It is very good. And yet at 6:40 in the morning, 11 months after the distress buoy had crossed the exclusion line, a dented single-occupant Velhari shuttle sat on Pad 7 with its landing struts slightly crooked, as if the pilot had never landed on a low-gravity world before. I know because I was there. I had come in early to catch up on a backlog of review forms, and I had watched it happen through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the documentation office. One moment, Pad 7 was empty. The next, it was not. My communicator went off 40 seconds later. It was the Port Authority supervisor, a man named Gerald Firth, who had been working the pads for 30 years and had the permanently unimpressed expression of someone who had seen absolutely everything. "Ren," he said. "You speak Velhari, yes?" "Yes." "Pad 7. I'll be right there." I grabbed my badge and my coat and went down to the pad level. Gerald was standing outside the barrier gate with 2 customs officers and the expression of a man who has found something unusual in his house and is waiting for an expert to tell him whether it is dangerous. The shuttle's door opened. She was tall for a Velhari, most of them are slender, but she had the kind of posture that added height, a straightness of spine that suggested either military training or a lifetime of refusing to make herself smaller. Her crest fins were deep amber, an unusual coloration, and they were held at a careful neutral angle, which in Velhari body language means, I am trying very hard not to signal anything that could be misread. She wore no council insignia. No diplomatic colors. Just a plain gray traveling suit and a small embroidered emblem on her left shoulder that I recognized after a moment, the Velhari Advocate Corps. Not a politician. A legal advocate. Someone whose job was to argue cases, represent individuals, navigate systems on behalf of people who could not navigate them alone. She walked down the landing steps and stopped in front of me. She looked at my badge. She looked at my face. Then she spoke in English. Clear, careful, slightly formal English, with the precise diction of someone who had learned it from written sources. "You are the translator on duty. I am Ren Okafor. I work in the documentation office. I speak Velhari, if that helps." Something moved in her crest fins, a ripple, there and gone. My name is Advocate Thessera Velaum, she said. I have crossed your exclusion zone without authorization. I understand this is a serious matter. I accept whatever diplomatic consequence your government determines is appropriate. She paused. I am asking only that before you process that consequence, someone listens to what I have to say. Gerald looked at me. I looked at Thessera. Did anyone from the council send you? I asked. No, she said. The council does not know I am here. If they did, I would not be here. I resigned my council advisory position 4 days ago. You came alone. Completely. Gerald scratched the back of his neck. I cannot let an unregistered alien national into the port without a holding protocol. I understand, Thessera said, still looking at me. I will go wherever you ask me to go. I only ask that someone listens. I looked at her for a long moment. Her crest fins were still carefully neutral, but around the base, where a Velhari's emotional expression is hardest to control, I could see a faint trembling. Not fear. Not anger. Exhaustion. The deep, bone-level exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time. Gerald, I said, I will take full personal responsibility for the holding protocol. 1 room, monitored, properly logged. I will conduct the initial interview myself. He looked at me for 3 full seconds. You know this is going to create a significant amount of paperwork, he said. I know. More than normal. A lot more. I know, Gerald. He sighed the sigh of a man who is ultimately reasonable and knows it. Room 4. I will send you the forms. Thessera followed me without being told to. She walked beside me, not behind, and she did not look around at the port with the curiosity most first-time visitors showed. She was focused, inward, carrying her purpose carefully. In room 4, a plain space with a table, 4 chairs, and a monitoring panel in the corner, I sat across from her and placed my recorder on the table. Before we start, I said, I should tell you that this conversation is logged and will be reviewed by my supervisors and potentially by government representatives. You should speak knowing that. I prefer it that way, she said. I want this on record. All right. I folded my hands on the table. Tell me why you are here. She was quiet for a moment. Her crest fin settled lower, a posture of directness, of choosing to be unguarded. The atmospheric processor grid on the Velhari homeworld will fail within 3 months, she said. Not 14 months. 3. The initial distress buoy underestimated the degradation rate because the technicians who sent it did not understand what they were reading. I have had our best remaining science advisors review the data. 3 months. I kept my face still. Our council representatives, she continued, have officially requested human engineering assistance through your parliamentary review board. I know this. I was involved in drafting that request. The board has had it for 11 months. The review process takes time, I said carefully. 3 months, she said again. We sat with that. The council, she continued, has instructed its members not to make direct contact with Terran citizens or facilities outside of official diplomatic channels. I am here in violation of that instruction. As I said, I resigned my advisory position to come. What I am about to tell you is not a council position. It is my own. She looked at me steadily. I am not here to ask you to save us. I am not here to argue that the secession was wrong. I spent many years inside the council's administrative bodies. I have read documents that I cannot discuss under formal disclosure protocols but that I will say, without giving specifics, confirmed for me everything Ambassador Voss said in her address. A pause. Everything. Then why are you here? I asked. Because 2 billion people on my world did not make those decisions. They were born into a system they did not design. Some of them are children. Many of them are old. They are not politicians. They are not administrators. They are people. Her voice stayed level. That made it harder, somehow, than if she had raised it. I am not asking the Terran government to restore the old arrangement. I am not asking for charity. I am here to ask, as one person to another, whether there is any path, any arrangement, any set of terms under which human engineers might come and teach our people what they need to know to operate what your people built. Not do it for us. Teach us. However long it takes. Whatever you need in return. She placed her hands flat on the table. I have no authority left. I have no diplomatic standing. I crossed your border in a ship that my nephew lent me because I could not file an official transit request without the council knowing. I am sitting in a monitoring room on a world that has every right to send me home in an hour. She looked at me. I am here because I had run out of official options and I still had one more thing I could try. I looked at her for a long time. Outside the room, I could hear the port going about its business. Cargo loaders, transit announcements, the ordinary rhythm of a world that was doing fine, getting along, building itself back up after decades of pouring its best people outward. I thought about the memo I had read 8 months ago. The word utility. The footnote that had been someone's entire community. I thought about Kira Voss setting down the council seal. I thought about the number 3 months, and what it looked like to 2 billion people who had no idea it was counting down. I am going to be honest with you, I said. Please, she said. I cannot make any decision here. I am a documentation officer. What I can do is write an urgent internal memo that goes above my supervisor's head to the Parliamentary Emergency Committee, citing new information that materially changes the timeline of the original review request. That is more than I expected, she said quietly. I will also, and this is not official, this is me telling you personally, I am going to recommend in that memo that your statement be heard at the committee level. Not the council's statement. Yours. Yours individually, as a private citizen who came here alone. I looked at her. Because I think the committee needs to hear the difference. Her crest fins moved. Not the careful neutral she had been holding since she landed. They rose, slightly, not high, not dramatic. Just enough to tell me that something in her had been very tightly coiled for a very long time, and had released a fraction. There will be public debate, I said. When this becomes known, and it will become known, there will be people in human space who say we should not help. That the consequences are what the council earned. Some of them will have arguments I cannot easily dismiss. I know, she said. And there will be people who say we should help unconditionally, immediately, no questions asked. And some of them will be right for the wrong reasons. I know that too. What do you think the right answer is? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think, she said slowly, that the right answer is not the one that makes either side feel best. I think it is the one that makes the most people safe without requiring anyone to go back to how things were. I nodded. I picked up my communicator and I sent Gerald a message that said, I need the emergency committee contact directory. He sent it back in 40 seconds, which meant he had already been expecting me to ask. I looked at Thessera Velaum, sitting in a monitoring room with no diplomatic standing and a nephew's borrowed shuttle and 3 months on a clock that most people did not know was running. You should probably eat something, I said. I think this is going to be a long day. The first real expression crossed her face, a small, genuine thing. Do you have anything without sulfur compounds in it? We cannot metabolize them. I think we can manage that, I said. And that was how it started. Not with a treaty or a policy or a grand declaration. With a woman who had crossed a border alone, and a man who had run out of reasons not to listen. The rest came later. But the rest always starts somewhere. We sent teachers. That was the word the parliamentary committee used when they released the official statement, teachers. Not aid workers. Not engineers dispatched under a relief framework. Teachers. The distinction mattered. It had been argued over for 6 weeks in closed committee session, and I know because I was in the room for 11 of those sessions as the official recorder. The final vote was not close. It was 61-9 in favor of the teaching mission, as it came to be called. The 9 votes against were not, as some people later claimed, votes for cruelty. They were votes from representatives who believed, genuinely and not without reason, that offering assistance of any kind, even conditional, even pedagogical, would be read by the old council structures as a signal that the secession could be undone with enough pressure. That if the galaxy cried long enough, humanity would come back. Those 9 representatives were not wrong to worry about that. We worried about it too. But 61 people looked at a number, 3 months, and looked at the word teach, and decided that there was a difference between going back and moving forward, even when the direction initially looked similar. Thessera Velam testified before the full committee on her 5th day in Port Callaway. She wore the same gray traveling suit. She had no prepared remarks, I know, because I had been designated as her liaison and she had told me she did not want them. If I cannot explain why I am here without notes, she said, then I am not the right person to be explaining it. She was in the chamber for 4 hours. She answered every question directly and without deflection, including the ones that were not easy to answer. When Representative Nora Haynes from the New Bristol constituency asked her whether the council had any intention of implementing the accountability standards that the secession address had outlined as the conditions for any future cooperation, Thessera said, I do not know. I no longer speak for the council. I can tell you that the people who were most resistant to those standards are also the ones who were most opposed to me coming here. Make of that what you will. Nora Haynes made a small sound and wrote something down. When Representative Cole Whitmore asked whether the Velhari government would be willing to open their administrative archives from the past century to independent review as a condition of the teaching mission, Thessera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I will say yes. I do not yet have the authority to say yes on behalf of my government. But I will say yes, and I will spend whatever time I have left after this mission trying to make that yes official. Cole Whitmore looked at her for a long time. That is a braver answer than I expected, he said. It is the only answer that is true, she said. The committee approved the teaching mission the following morning. I will skip over the 6 weeks of logistics that followed, not because they were unimportant, but because they were not dramatic, and I promised myself I would not waste your time on things that were not dramatic. There were contracts to draft, specialist lists to compile, equipment manifests, cultural briefings, safety protocols for our people entering a space that was technically now foreign territory. There was a very long argument about what the ships should be called, which I will also skip, except to say that the final choice, instructor vessels, was boring and correct, and everyone agreed it was boring and correct, and we moved on. What mattered was who went. 412 people volunteered for the first rotation. Engineers, atmospheric specialists, medical technicians, educators who had experience translating technical knowledge across cultural barriers. They were not selected for being the best in their fields, they were selected for being the best teachers in their fields, which is a different quality entirely. You can know everything about a subject and still be unable to help someone else understand it. The people on those ships could do both. I was offered a position as a cultural liaison. I took it. Claire Alderton signed off on my transfer without a word, then shook my hand, which from Claire was a considerable expression of feeling. Patrick Cole was assigned as crew chief on the lead vessel. He found out when I did. We looked at each other across the briefing room. Your grandfather, I said. Yeah, he said. We did not say anything else. We did not need to. The fleet, 5 instructor vessels, 60 support craft, and 1 very dented Velhari shuttle that Thessera refused to leave behind, saying it was sentimental, crossed the exclusion line on a clear Tuesday morning. I watched the line go by on the navigation display from the bridge. A coordinate. An invisible mark in space that had meant, for 18 months, the edge of the world. We crossed it going the other direction. The Velhari greeting party met us at the outer relay station. It was not a large gathering. The council had advised against any public ceremony, likely because they were not sure whether this mission was a diplomatic victory for them or evidence of their own failure, and had decided that quiet was safer than public attention. Thessera, who was officially a private citizen with no standing, stood at the front of the human delegation anyway. I stood beside her. The Velhari station commander, a young woman named Vel Oris, who had the look of someone who had been given a job that was much bigger than her title, met us at the dock. She looked at the human delegation. She looked at Thessera. You actually came back, she said to Thessera, in Velhari. I told you I would, Thessera said. Vel Oris looked back at the human delegation. Her crest fins moved, a complicated motion that meant several things at once. I translated it later for Patrick as something close to, I did not believe this was possible and I am not sure yet whether to be relieved or terrified. Patrick said, that is extremely relatable. We got to work. The atmospheric processor grid was not the only system in distress, which we had expected. When you pull the maintenance team from an interconnected infrastructure and leave documentation without training, the problems do not appear in one place, they propagate. Like a crack in ice. By the time you see one, there are already 20 you have not found yet. Our engineers started with the grid because that was the timer with the shortest countdown. They did not go in and fix it. That was the agreement and that was the principle, and nobody in the teaching mission broke it. They went in with our specialists on one side and Velhari technicians on the other, and they worked through the problem together, out loud, step by step, explaining every decision. It was slower. It was much slower. There were moments when a human engineer would see the solution in front of them and have to hold back from simply implementing it, and I watched a few of them practice the particular discipline of saying, "What do you think the next step is?" when they already knew the answer and the clock was ticking. One of those engineers was a woman named Lydia Marsh. She had been running atmospheric maintenance for 20 years, she had worked on this very grid, on a contract rotation, 8 years before the secession. She knew the system the way most people know their own kitchen. I was with her on day 4 in Sector 7 when a young Velhari technician named Oren worked through a catalysis recalibration sequence on his own. Lydia walked him through the logic but did not touch the controls. He made 2 small errors, caught both of them himself, corrected them, and completed the sequence. The system confirmed calibration. The readout went green. Oren stared at it. Then he looked at Lydia. She said nothing. She nodded. Once. His crest fins rose high, not the careful neutral, not the distressed trembling. They rose the way they do when a Velhari feels something large and bright and unexpected. He would remember how to do that sequence now. Not because a manual told him. Because he had done it. Because his hands knew the weight of it. Because he had made the errors and caught them himself, and that experience lived in him now in a way that no written instruction ever could. I wrote about that moment in my log that evening. I do not know why it hit me as hard as it did. I had seen people learn things before. I had been present at significant events that had more obvious claim to being important. But watching Oren's crest fins rise, that was when I understood what the teaching mission actually was. Not repair work. Not charity. Not even diplomacy, quite. It was the first honest transaction humanity had made with another species in 300 years. We had something they needed. We were offering it on terms that were fair and that would leave them stronger, not more dependent. No hidden cost. No leveraged obligation. Just knowledge, crossing a table, being exchanged for the dignity of both sides. Not everything went smoothly. I said I would not waste your time on things that were not dramatic, so I should tell you about the Dreth. The Dreth hegemony had watched the teaching mission announcement with a silence that our political analysts described as considered. They had not requested any assistance, their engineering teams were more developed than the Velhari, and their infrastructure, though also Terran-designed, had been partially documented by their own technical core over the years. What the Dreth had was not an infrastructure crisis. What the Dreth had was the dawning, uncomfortable realization that the information gap between themselves and humanity was larger than they had admitted to themselves, and that the teaching mission was making that gap visible to the entire galaxy in real time. On the 15th day of the mission, 3 Dreth heavy vessels entered the Velhari outer system and established a parallel approach vector to Instructor Vessel 2. They did not attack. They did not threaten. They broadcast a signal on an open channel, addressed to the Terran Mission Command, stating that they wished to inspect the nature of the technology being transferred, to ensure it did not violate hegemony interests. What they meant, and everyone knew what they meant, was that they believed there was a secret somewhere. That the reason humans had been so indispensable for so long was not because we were good teachers, or good engineers, or good doctors, or because we showed up when things needed doing. They believed there was something else. A technique. A compound. A hidden process. Something that if they could extract it, they could replicate everything we had done without needing to learn it themselves. Vessel 2's captain, a calm and deliberate man named Owen Park, responded to the Dreth signal on the same open channel. He said, "You are welcome to observe any part of the teaching mission that the Velhari hosts consent to. There is no proprietary technology being transferred. There is no classified process. We are showing people how systems work. You are welcome to watch." The Dreth vessels maintained their approach for 6 hours. Then they held position. Then, quietly, without any further communication, they withdrew. The open channel had been the key. Owen had understood that immediately. The Dreth were looking for secrecy because secrecy was where they expected the power to be hidden. By being completely, almost aggressively transparent, come look, come listen, it is all right here, he had removed the mystery. And a Dreth intelligence operation with no mystery to uncover tends to conclude quickly that there is nothing worth the resource expenditure. What happened next, though, was not something Owen had planned. The open channel had been broadcasting. The whole exchange had gone across the Galactic Relay Network. 14 other species had been listening. And the next morning, our mission command received 7 separate requests for teaching mission extensions, not to the Velhari, but to their worlds. Not demands. Requests. Polite, formal, careful requests. 3 of them included preliminary offers of terms. I remember reading those requests on the bridge of the lead instructor vessel, sitting next to Patrick, both of us on second cups of coffee. 7, Patrick said. 7, I said. In one morning. In one morning. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Granddad, he said, very quietly. Yeah, I said. We had a lot of work ahead of us. But we had the people for it. And for the first time in a very long time, we were doing it on our own terms. The old council dissolved on a Thursday. Not dramatically. Not with a great final session or a closing ceremony or a speech from the presiding bench. It dissolved the way old structures often do, gradually, then all at once. First, the Dreth hegemony suspended its membership, citing irreconcilable divergence of governance principles. Then 4 smaller species followed within a week, each for different stated reasons that all pointed to the same underlying truth: the system they had belonged to was no longer offering them more than it was costing them, and they had finally done the arithmetic. The Velhari stayed longest. I think they stayed out of loyalty to an idea more than to the institution. But on the morning of the final session, a session attended by 9 species, down from 47, the Velhari delegation cast one final vote, abstained from the closing motion, and went home. The Galactic Council's last official communication was a maintenance notification. A routine update about navigational beacon schedules. It went out automatically, processed by systems that continued running for 3 more days before someone remembered to shut them off. I found out about the dissolution from Thessera, who sent me a message that said simply, "It is done." 3 words. Nothing more. We were on Velorum Station by then, a jointly operated waypoint that had been established as a logistical hub for the now 12-mission teaching expansion. 12 worlds. 419 human specialists at any given time, rotating through 6-month assignments. A fleet of 19 instructor vessels and their support craft. A budget negotiated through the new bilateral agreements that each species had signed individually with the Terran Compact, on terms that had taken weeks to reach and that nobody was completely happy with, which Lydia Marsh said was how you knew they were fair. I sat with Thessara's 3-word message for a long time. Then I went to find her. She was in the station's planning room, a wide space with transparent walls that looked out on the construction yard where the new joint docking extensions were being built. Velhari latticework framing. Human atmospheric shielding. Dreth quantum optic lighting strips that one of our engineers had bartered for in exchange for a week of plumbing consultation, a transaction that had required so many layers of authorization on both sides that it had become something of a running joke on the station. The room was full of people working. Vel Oris had expanded her role considerably since those first uncertain days in the docking bay. She was now the station's joint operations coordinator, which meant she spent most of her time at a very large table covered in overlapping schedules, trying to make sure that nobody's work stepped on anyone else's work. She had developed, over the past year and a half, a particular expression, jaw set, crest fins at problem-solving angle, that her staff had privately named the Oris look, and which meant that something needed fixing immediately, but she had already identified how. Lydia Marsh was in the corner running a technical debrief with a group of 4 Velhari engineers who had just completed their first independent maintenance cycle without any human supervision. The debrief was conducted partly in Velhari and partly in English, with occasional lapses into a spontaneous shared vocabulary that had developed on the station over 18 months, technical terms that did not exist precisely in either language, invented on the spot by people who needed words for new things. Patrick was helping a young Dreth observer, one of 11 who had come aboard 6 months ago for what the hegemony had carefully described as a non-participatory educational review, and who had, by the 3rd week, quietly started participating, understand a flow diagram for water reclamation. The Dreth did not drink water the way humans did, but they had water analog systems, and the principles translated well enough that the diagram made sense with some creative labeling. I found Thessera by the far window, looking at the construction yard. She had changed over the past year and a half. Not in a way that was immediately visible, she was still straight-backed, still careful with her expressions, still the most precise thinker I had encountered in any species. But there was something less coiled about her now. The exhaustion that had been in her when she stepped off that dented shuttle in Port Callaway, the bone-deep weariness of someone carrying a thing alone, was not there anymore. "It is done," I said, paraphrasing her message. "The Council," she said. "Yes. How do you feel?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I feel that it needed to happen," she said. "I feel that it should have happened differently, 30 years ago, in a way that could have prevented a great deal of suffering. I feel that I am glad it is over, and I feel that I am frightened about what comes next." "Frightened of what?" She turned from the window to look at me. "Frightened that the people who come after us will build the same thing again. The same hierarchy. The same assumptions. The same comfortable arrangement where some species do the difficult work and the rest take the benefit without acknowledging it." She looked back at the construction yard. "Structures have gravity. They pull people toward familiar shapes. Without something to hold against that pull, you build a new house that looks different from the outside and is identical on the inside. That is why we wrote the charter," I said. "The charter of mutual dependency," she said, with the careful tone of someone who worked on a document and knows both what it says and what it does not yet say. "It is a good document. Ren, I helped write it. I know what is in it and what is missing from it. It establishes that no species' infrastructure can be treated as another species' sole responsibility. It establishes joint maintenance obligations. It establishes educational exchange requirements. It establishes that every species must demonstrate operational competency in any system they depend on." "Those are real requirements," I said. "They are. And they will require constant pressure to enforce." "Structures have gravity," she said again. "The charter pushes against it. But gravity does not give up." I looked out at the construction yard. The Velhari lattice framing, delicate, precise, almost sculptural in the way it distributed load. The human atmospheric shielding, dense, layered, practical in the way that engineering tends toward when practicality is the only standard. The Dreth lighting, which cast everything in a slightly cooler tone that was actually easier on human eyes than standard fluorescence, a fact that exactly no one had predicted. It was, I noted, a genuinely odd-looking building. Nothing matched. The proportions were slightly off. The materials had been chosen for function rather than aesthetic consistency, and the result was something that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different interrupted projects. I thought it was one of the more interesting buildings I had ever seen. "The compact session is in 4 days," I said. "I know. Are you ready for it?" Thessera turned from the window and looked at me directly. "Ren," she said. "I have been ready for it for 30 years. I was not in a position to do anything about it for most of those years, but I have been ready." The interspecies compact signing was held on Velorum Station because it was the most neutral location anyone could agree on. Not a purpose-built diplomatic center. Not an ancient council chamber. A working station, currently under construction, smelling slightly of fresh sealant and the particular metallic tang that Dreth quantum optic cables gave off when they were being calibrated. 11 species signed. Not 47. 11. Most of the Council's former members were still in the process of internal reorganization, or waiting to see what the compact looked like after its first year, or, in the case of the Dreth, engaged in a very long internal argument about whether joining first or joining strategically was the better approach. I had been told by a Dreth observer, in confidence, that the argument had been going on for 8 months and was not close to concluding. "We are thorough," the observer had said, with what I had come to recognize as Dreth dry humor. 11 species. Including humanity. The signing chamber had been set up in the station's largest assembly room, which was still technically a construction zone on 2 of its 4 walls. Someone had put up temporary panels to hide the unfinished sections, but they had not quite covered everything, and you could see the edge of a Velhari structural beam peeking out from behind the left panel, which several delegates found distracting and which I found appropriate. I stood at the back of the room. I had no official role in the signing. I was, by this point, the senior cultural liaison of the teaching mission, which was a title that would carry over into the compact framework as a mid-level position in the Joint Education Office, meaningful work, not especially grand. The kind of position where you are useful without being prominent, which is the kind of position I had always been most comfortable in. Kira Voss watched the signing from New Carthage via live relay. She had sent a message the previous day that said she was glad, and that she hoped we had got the wording right in Section 14, and that she was going back to her garden now. That was Kira. Owen Park sat in the second row of the human delegation, still looking calm and deliberate. Lydia Marsh was not in the room. She was in the construction yard supervising a training session on the new docking bay systems, because the session had been scheduled months ago and she saw no reason to move it. Patrick was standing near the door, because Patrick always stood near the door, an old crew chief habit. He caught my eye once during the signing and gave me a small nod. Thessera Vel signed for the Velhari as a private citizen advocate who had been granted temporary official standing by the Velhari government for this specific purpose and no other. She had insisted on the distinction. She wanted the record to show that she had not come back into formal power, she had been borrowed for a task and would hand the authority back when it was done. She signed with a Velhari mark press, which makes a pattern rather than a name. Her pattern was one I recognized from her shoulder emblem, the Advocate Corps sigil, modified slightly in a way that, she had told me once, indicated the signatory was acting in personal conscience rather than institutional capacity. She pressed it firmly. She lifted it. She looked at the mark on the charter. Then she looked up and found me in the back of the room. I could not read her expression from that distance. I did not need to. I knew what it was. The same thing it had been when she walked into that monitoring room on Pad 7 in Port Callaway, and I had said that someone would listen. Relief. Deep, earned, bone-level relief. The compact came into formal effect the next morning. I walked through the station that day, my station, now, in a sense I still had to get used to, and I noticed things I had not noticed before. Or rather, I noticed them differently. The Velhari technician in Corridor 7 who stopped to explain a calibration step to a Muir observer without being asked. The human engineer and the Dreth observer eating lunch together in the common area, the engineer using the few Dreth compound words she had learned to describe the food, the observer using the few English words he had learned to describe what he thought of it, both of them laughing at the inadequacy of both vocabularies. Vel Oris, in the planning room, with the Oris look on her face, pointing at a schedule with 3 people from 3 different species leaning in to look at the same problem. Not at each other. At the problem. I thought about what Thessera had said. About structures having gravity. About the pull toward familiar shapes. She was right. The charter would need defending. The compact would face pressure. Species that had been at the top of the old hierarchy would not give that position up easily, and some of them had long memories and considerable resources. There would be arguments about Section 14 and Section 22 and the enforcement mechanisms and the exceptions clauses. There would be years where it felt like the whole thing was one bad decision away from unraveling. But then I thought about Orin's crest fins rising when the system went green. And Vel Oris making the Oris look at a problem that now had 3 species looking at it with her. And Patrick Cole, standing near the door, nodding. And Lydia Marsh, in the construction yard, not attending the historic signing because she had a training session, because the training session was the point, because the historic signing only mattered if the training session happened. I addressed my log that evening. I do not usually write in my log for other people to read. But that night I did, because it felt like something needed to be said clearly, in plain words, in a record. I wrote, they asked us what made us so essential. For 300 years they asked it, and for 300 years they looked in the wrong places. They looked at our technology, our medicine, our engineering. They looked at our work. They thought if they could identify the formula, they could replicate the result without needing us at all. The formula was not in the work. It was in the approach. We showed up. That was it. When something needed doing, we did it. When something needed learning, we learned it. When something broke, we fixed it, and then we stayed until we understood why it had broken, so we could prevent it breaking again. We did this because it needed doing, not because anyone was watching, and not because we had been asked politely enough. The hard part, the part we have spent 300 years getting wrong, and are still, as of this evening, learning, was knowing when to stop. Knowing when showing up for other people means not showing up for yourself. Knowing the difference between being generous and being used. Knowing when the person you are helping has learned enough to stand without you, and having the restraint to step back and let them. We are still learning that part. So are they. I think that is all right. Learning things together is, I have come to believe, the only honest way to learn anything important. I stopped writing. Outside the viewport of my quarters, the construction yard was lit with Dreth quantum optic light, cool and clear against the dark. A Velhari structural frame rose above it, precise and slightly sculptural. Human atmospheric panels gleamed between the beams. It still looked like 3 interrupted projects. It still looked like something I had never seen before. I closed my log and went to sleep. The galaxy had a great deal of work ahead of it. So did we. Good thing we had always been good at showing up.